when a great conversation happens in the choral rehearsal, it is transformational. It really enables people to be seen, to be feel heard. It improves relationships between members of the choir and between the conductor, and it results in a stronger, more artistically expressive and connected performance that is more deeply felt among the performers and has a greater impact on the audience. The reason I even strung these words together has to do with the fact that the words choral rehearsal is where conversations can take place, and where a lot of transformation can happen. It's also where sometimes things can go wrong if the conversation isn't particularly useful or healthy. Um, right relationships is a term that I learned as I became music director at in a Unitarian Universalist church, where right relationships and constructing environments for where right relationships can flourish is really important when you're dealing with groups of people who don't necessarily believe the same thing. And then conversations, of course. Having these meaningful conversations is one of the things that most makes my work meaningful and powerful. And what is required in order to facilitate these conversations? I would say in my experience, I've identified three things, and they are storytelling, deep listening, and creating and maintaining inclusive space. So, to begin, storytelling can be defined as the social and cultural activity of sharing stories. It can be a means of entertainment, it can be educational, it can serve as a way of as a form of cultural preservation, or it can help to instill moral values. Unitarian Universalist minister Paula Cole Jones um, told a phenomenal sermon um, at Neighborhood Church a few weeks ago about how storytelling allows us to be moved by someone else's experience. I had a powerful encounter with a musicologist named Dr. Elizabeth Bergman at where I teach, and in the as I was teaching my students a piece called Hiawatha's Wedding Feast by African British composer Samuel Coleridge Taylor. Dr. Bergman came in, and because she's a musicologist and specializes in indigenous cultures um, and settler colonialism, I asked her to come in and talk a little bit about some of these issues. And what she did was she came in and told not the story of Hiawatha, but the story of the people on whom the piece Hiawatha's Wedding Feast is based. And then she told the story of the people who were influenced by the people on whom the story was based. And in this massive, sort of beautiful weaving of stories of culture and experience and settler colonialism and transnational sociocultural issues and all these kind of these kind of really uh, complex, concepts, she found a way to kind of melt them all down into this beautiful storytelling that really engaged my students in a way that made them feel in a way that caused them to ask questions and be curious and make connections between their personal experience and the experience of the people about whom she was telling the stories. And our learning and performing of Hiawatha's Wedding Feast um, was invigorated in a way I never could have imagined, having performed the piece before in other communities, and but never having gotten into the storytelling and into and allowing the time to tell the story. um, that's what was transformational, is that we took the time to actually let the storytelling unfold and to let the students process and ask questions and draw conclusions and form um, and form relationships with the with what they were hearing, and also um, form connections and understandings between each others as they kind of shared their own personal experiences in the context of the choir. The second aspect of conversations that I think is helpful is deep listening. According to University of Minnesota Center for Spirituality and Healing, deep listening is a process of listening to learn. It requires the temporary suspension of judgment and a willingness to receive new information. And that's whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. I attended a few years ago, I attended the Stanley King Institute. That experience was really powerful because that's where I learned some really uh, effective techniques to apply deep listening with my students in the classroom and also on a one-on-one basis. One-on-one relationships are really important in establishing trust. Even in the classroom, when you're dealing with students as a whole, it's important to have individual relationships with those students, and deep listening can help with that. Students look to teachers all the time for guidance, whether they are aware of it or not. Whether we are aware of it or not, in any given moment, we are guiding them by our responses, our actions, and our inactions. Students' needs are both evident and hidden, and they seek adults who can handle feelings and experiences they sometimes can't. The Institute teaches participants how to listen deeply and to respond in ways that promote learning, meaningful relationships, and responsible behavior. Daily, I try to utilize this. I really try to make space for students to engage in some kind of conversation in every class, if even just for a few minutes. Um, Sometimes I invite them because we've been online. It's been helpful to use the chat feature on Zoom so that people can sort of more than one person can talk at once. Sometimes it's helpful to avoid, the question and answer thing, and only certain students speak up. The more extroverted ones tend to take hog the spotlight, and the more introverted ones tend to be silent. So by using the chat feature, it really helps to engage more of the students. But the most important thing that I get out of these daily classroom talks um, is creating the space for the students to fill it, for their thoughts and their experiences and their stories to fill that space. So when I'm facilitating a discussion, I know I need to listen and affirm without inserting myself into the conversation. This is probably one of the most difficult things, is to always we tend, even on one-on-one conversations, to try and empathize by drawing a parallel with our own experience to what that person is describing. And that is actually not helpful in engaging in deep listening, because to listen deeply is to remove yourself and allow another person's or another group to fill the space, and you take that in without inserting yourself into the space. um, and that doesn't mean that you don't relate to it. That just means that you're you don't have to fill the space every time with your own personal thoughts and experiences, just to affirm the experiences that are being expressed by saying, I hear you, I see that. And this is helpful because in doing this, we model deep listening for our students. If they see us able to hear without putting our own spin on it, without making a comment or offering an opinion, or telling our own story that relates to it. If they can see us modeling this deep listening well, where we don't insert ourselves into the conversation, then they too can will start to understand and see how effective this way of facilitating a conversation um, can be. The third thing is inclusive space. So Oxford Languages defines inclusivity as not excluding any of the parties or groups involved in something, as a, a continuous area or expanse which is free, available, or unoccupied. I know from personal experience what it's like to be in a room where a conversation is supposed to be happening, and yet you don't necessarily feel in not feeling included in the space for one reason or another. For me, I've felt that way being the only woman in a room. I felt that way being the only Black person in a room. Um, those with those two identities, that's it has created challenges that make me question where I belong and whether I belong, and whether what I'm saying is truly being heard for what the words I'm using, or whether whether I'm there to represent, my identity group, which is way too much pressure. I would have loved to have whoever is facilitating the conversation has taken the time to know me personally, to know the individuals in the ensemble personally, to do the research and do the homework and have a personal understanding of the dynamics in the room, of the various parties or involved groups or individuals, the diversity that is actually in the room, seeing beyond just the my external identifiers, the color of my skin and the my gender appearance, but seeing me as a person, an individual person with individual thoughts that are unique just because of my humanity, just like every other human is unique. Um, I feel like though where I felt that, those have been the moments where I have felt the most free to participate in a transformative conversation. Um, my good friend and colleague, Dr. Alexander Lloyd Blake, knows this firsthand as the founder and artistic director of the Los Angeles-based group Tonality. What's a conversation that you recall from Tonality that really brought a piece of music to the next level? And maybe when was the first time that you noticed that happen?
Sure, I think it was actually Tonality's first concert, um,
Mm,
or Tonality's first social justice concert. We
mm,
were doing When David Heard, Norman Dinnerstein,
mm-hmm,
and I remember there's just a section of the piece that just was not going well. I mean, there's a lot of landing on final chords that have kind of, I think it's a F versus G flat, and just kind of really making all of that fit well. Um, and I remember, yeah, we were just having some issues, and one of the singers, this was our gun violence concert, one of the singers started talking about how her best friend was shot and killed by her boyfriend,
mm.
and really just talked about kind of the why we were doing that piece, and we never had a problem with that piece again. And it really was a lesson for me, as I'm sitting here talking about like the theory and like the harmonies and stuff like that, the nuts and bolts. uh we're all musicians, we're all talented, people are there, but there was a level of empathy that was heightened.
Mm.
And I think, you know, I don't know if you can measure that in chords and in harmonic progressions, but there's clearly an advancement of understanding and a coming together of will and intent that came through empathy and support. And I think, to me, that was the first time I think I had learned how to value that time.
What does it take to get into these conversations to the point where you feel like you're having a deep listening experience, like versus just kind of a surface level conversation?
Yeah, I mean, that type of trust and vulnerability certainly has to be built over an amount of time. And I think,
Mm,
uh, it's funny, talking a lot about kind of as the head of those spaces, you have to set the expectations, kind of what I've been saying to a lot of people. I felt like in this way, it was almost kind of, be aware enough to get out of the way.
Ooh.
Because this wasn't a, that certainly was not like a manufactured type of thing. I didn't know was happening. But when
Mm-hmm.
the person started talking,
Mm-hmm.
there was a part of me that was just like, this is an important story. And there's like so much that needs to get done. In the rehearsal, not knowing, afterwards, like how much time she saved us.
Mm.
And so, I
So it's
think,
almost like an investment.
yeah, absolutely. And kind of I would say that set the stage for that concert, that season, how tonality engages in concerts. It really was
And it
transformational. And
starts
so,
with the hypothesis is that a deeper conversation, deeper listening, and better storytelling can take place more efficiently, effectively, and transformatively when a space feels inclusive and safe. And when that doesn't happen, it can be extremely awkward and even painful.
like that type of vulnerability, you have to set, I think that is where you have to set the stage,
Mm.
um, where people feel like their stories and their experiences are not getting in the way of what you're trying to do, but that, you really create a space where you want to hear that. And I think you have to you have to ask the question, you have to sit in silence, and you have to really, make sure that people know, because I don't think that's how our choral places are set, really. I think you have to really kind of reset and recontextualize, like this space is about learning the music together, but what that experience involves, and it involves more of you than your voice. And I think we really have to be a part of creating that environment. Um, I think there are so many environments where inclusivity is not at the forefront or the priority of rehearsals. And I think, you can feel, I think audiences can feel, and I think we as performers can understand when our audience gets the sense that the empathy that they eventually feel has stemmed from the ensemble versus, I'm here to watch a very polished performance, and an emotionally distanced experience.
Mm.
I think it's apparent, um, and it's not even about the, it's funny, it's not about the nuts and bolts, but then
Mm.
the nuts and bolts are there because the engagement and the communal spirit of performing is so much broader and deeper than what's on the page. There is no music in my hands, nowhere near me, and we're clearly having a conversation. And I think that's when, singers know, like, oh, like we're gonna be here. We're gonna be in this space for a second. And so, there's that shift of like, I need to take myself out of that like professional singer only mode and
Mm-hmm.
become a human again. And then through hearing people, through asking questions, through allowing silence and space for people to feel like they have agency to speak, um, I think that's where those spaces can be built. That takes practice, I think, because I did not experience many choral environments like that.
Neither did I. Um, huh.
What I have found, um, is that when I do give the time to allow students to engage in those types of conversations, then they become invested in the why, uh, of the art that we do, and it makes their learning. I would say it makes our artistic quality better too, but I think it's the whole learning experience. Um, you're no longer fighting people, and teenagers can be, all the great things that they could be. Um, but, you know, when they have also bought in because you have allowed them space to engage in some of that, and they get to carry some of that when they have their own opinions. Um, I think that does transform the space.
I would imagine that the repertoire has a lot to do with being able to have the conversation. If I, want to do, Bach, for example. Dona no ispacem, that's what I mean. Um, that's acceptable. So how do we what would be an example of a conversation you might have to have in order to get to the next level there, and how would you do that with your singers?
We get to contextualize any piece, I think. And I think really how we shape the why for the work that we're doing. First of all, I think we need to understand that like that is important. I think too many times we go in and it's just like it's Bach, it's valuable.
That
And
right there.
I was just like, you don't allow people to engage. Not to say that that can't be valid, but like Bach is not valid just because those four letters are placed in that order. I mean, you still have to do the work, especially for people for whom that does not feel relevant. And I think we place this value as in this is high art, therefore you should automatically um, gravitate toward it and understand its significance. And if you don't, who are you? And so
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
so um,
So smooth.
I I think we get to contextualize, but I think really just having the priority, knowing the priority of the sorry, I'm still thinking about nosy Siri. If your priority is to have your students engage, I think that actually broadens which pieces can be considered important. Um, and so, if it's Bach, if it's classical music, um, I was going to say you might have to work harder. I don't think that's true. I think you just have to work. I don't think that we have done the work to
Hey,
really
they're right
figure out
there.
how to make these pieces valuable um, without just standing alone and just saying it is valuable because how dare you not know better. And
Hey,
so
thank
Bach
you.
had a
Thank
life. Bach had struggles. These pieces weren't written. They weren't composed in a vacuum. You know. So what if there's a way to learn about, or what if there's a way to talk about how Messiah was used to help, you know, for fees for people in prison? Like, what if that kind of stuff was mentioned? All of a sudden, Messiah doesn't become just another like piece that you happen to hear in the Christmas, but it actually has like a valid use that then opens up so many conversations. And so, yeah, this whole like arts for art, let it speak for itself. It's like, sure, if you're working with populations who have been engaged and ingrained and for whom that music directly like reflects in terms of how they see themselves, because none of us are Austrian in this country, but anyways, um, but I think in general, just I think we can do more work um, to contextualize the pieces of the canon so that students can then, when they don't have this veil of this high art um, kind of hierarchical elitism,
yeah.
um, then when that's pulled away, then we can talk about the beauty that Bach brings and the beauty that we can learn, all the tools that we can learn in classical music. But that work has to be done alongside bringing the music and that meaning to people and not just sitting it on a pedestal and saying, well, of course it's important.
Right. Platform. Thank you.